Before we talk about love in 2023, let's talk about love in, say, 3000 BC, the beginning of Jewish civilization. When people talk about traditional marriage, what do they mean? Well, I want to share with you three traditional Jewish stories of love, one from the Bible, one from rabbinic literature, and one from the Jewish nostalgia industry. So the first one we'll look at is a story that appears in the book of Genesis. It's the story of Jacob and Rachel and Leah. Now, Isaac, if you may recall, had two sons. He had Jacob, his favored son, and Esau, his less favored son. And Isaac was very concerned about whom Jacob would marry. Isaac sent for Jacob and blessed him, it says in Genesis 28. He instructed him, saying, "You shall not take a wife from among the Canaanite women." So he certainly knew who not to marry. "Go up to Padan Aram, the home of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take a wife there from among the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother." In other words, marry a cousin. Keep it in the family. Stay in the tribe, the clan, right? Don't marry outside. "May El Shaddai bless you, make you fertile and numerous, so you become an assembly of peoples. May you and your offspring be granted the blessing of Abraham, to possess the land where you are sojourning, which God assigned to Abraham." So if you go and follow the rules, may you be fertile. He doesn't say, may you find love. Find the right bride and be fertile. And in Genesis 29, he does indeed find the right family. He comes to the land in the east, and he sees a well in the open. When the flocks would gather there, the shepherds together would roll the stone from the well, because it took several of them to move the stone off the mouth of the well. He asks them where they are from. They say from Haran. He says, "Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?" This is his uncle. They say, "Yes, we do." "Is he well?" They say, "Yes. And here is his daughter Rachel coming with his flock." Wow, it's like a sign. It's almost as if there was an author to this story, which there is. It's still broad daylight, too early to round up the animals. And they say, "Well, we have to wait until we roll the stone from the mouth of the well." And here comes Rachel with her father's flock. She was the shepherdess. And when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of his uncle Laban, he went up and rolled the stone off the mouth, all by himself, like a superhero, rolled the stone off the mouth of the well and watered the flock of his uncle Laban. And Jacob kissed Rachel and then broke into tears. He told Rachel he was her father's kinsman, that he was Rebekah's son. She ran and told her father. And on hearing the news of his sister's son Jacob, Laban ran to meet him, embraced him and kissed him, brought him into his house. And so Laban said to Jacob, "You're going to work for me. Tell me what your wages will be." Now there were two daughters of Laban. The older one was Leah, the younger one was Rachel. Leah has weak eyes, it says, but Rachel was shapely and beautiful. Jacob, this is the first time, I think, in the Hebrew Bible, the word love appears. Jacob loved Rachel. She hasn't said a word to him, but he loved her. And so he answered, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel." Laban says, this is what every prospective father-in-law should do, "Better that I give her to you than I give her to someone else. Stay with me." And so he served for 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of his love for her. Now, what's positive about this story of Jacob meeting Rachel? What are some of the positive signs of love we see there? Okay, hormones at work, yes, definitely. Well, maybe they're not, we'll say, calculated hormones. They are raging hormones. I mean, you do have physical attraction. That's a component of partnership, right? At least in one direction, yes. A willingness to wait, to work within conventions, right? I mean, on some level, marriage is a convention. And as we know today, it's no longer required for having children, for having a life partnership. You don't have to go through a formal wedding. So the idea of having a convention that you work within, or even showing patience to wait and being elevated in feelings such that the waiting doesn't even matter because his love is so great that 7 years is like a day. Anything else positive out of this? What is negative out of this love story? She doesn't say a word so far. That's right. We don't know what she thinks. She ran to tell her father that this strange man kissed her. Like that, that's all we know. And he's tremendously strong, right? Yes. They don't know each other. That's right. We don't even know if they had time to talk or to get, I mean, 7 years, you would imagine there's some communication, but nothing is recorded here. Well, you're saying it was a vote of hope to wait 7 years given the mortality rates. Although I do need to point out that the reason mortality rates were so low is from infant and child mortality. That is, if you made it to age 15 or so, you were likely to make it to 50 or 60, because if the average age, average mortality was 40, that factors in all the child stillbirths and the children that died of diseases. And so the people that died before 10 are factored into that average age. If you made it to 20, you're probably going to make it to 50 or 60, other than lightning bolts, right? So clearly this doesn't match our criteria for a loving partnership, for a free partnership. Remember, they have to talk to her uncle about whether he can marry her. It's his decision what to do. And in fact, what he does is he substitutes the older daughter, Leah, in place of Rachel and tricks him so that in the end he marries both of the sisters because he really wants Rachel, but he's stuck with Leah since he already has married her. But even Isaac, Jacob's father, is telling him who to marry and who not to marry. This is not the free market of love. This is a very limited selection. Must be approved by the clan, the tribe, the parents. So let's look at a second story about love, and it's the reason why this topic is our topic for this Shabbat. It's a story that appears only in the Mishnah, which is the first collection of rabbinic sayings that dates to around the year 200 of the Common Era, including sayings of rabbis who lived before. So let's say the first couple hundred years of the Common Era. And at the very end of the section of the Mishnah talking about fast days, days you're not allowed to eat, we find this really fascinating passage. And this passage describes a holiday that has not been celebrated in Jewish life for many centuries. It's made a renaissance lately because it's a kind of Valentine's Day. And so because Valentine's Day technically is a Catholic holiday with Saint Valentine and martyrdom and all kinds of other backstory, Jews decided, well, let's find our own day to celebrate love. And you're not going to find it in the Torah. There's no love holiday there. But this holiday seems to fit the bill. It's about a holiday called the 15th of Av, which is also known as Tu B'Av. Just like Tu B'Shvat is the 15th of the month of Shvat, this is the 15th of the month of Av. Also remember, by the way, what happens on the 15th of every Jewish month? It's a full moon. And if you're thinking fertility symbols, the symbol of the moon and the woman's cycle and the fully pregnant moon, right, that then shrinks and then grows again, it's very weighted. And so the fact that this event took place on the 15th of the month and the full moon is not an accident. So here's what Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said. There were no days as joyous for the Jewish people as the 15th of Av and as Yom Kippur. As on them, the daughters of Jerusalem would go out in white clothes, which each woman had borrowed from another. Why were they borrowed? So as not to embarrass those who did not have their own white garments. So everyone is equal. It doesn't matter what your background is. You all borrow something and you're all out there in the white garments. All the garments they borrowed require immersion in the mikvah, the ritual bath. And the daughters of Jerusalem would go out and dance in the vineyards. What would they say? Young man, lift up your eyes and see what you choose for yourself for a wife. Do not set your eyes on beauty, but set your eyes toward a good family. As the verse in Proverbs says, grace is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. As it further says in the book of Proverbs, give her the fruit of her hands and let her works praise her in the gates. And it says in another verse, go forth, daughters of Zion, and gaze upon King Solomon on the day of the wedding, and so on. On the day of the wedding, this has to do, it says in the rabbinic interpretation, with the giving of the Torah. The day of the gladness of his heart, this is the building of the temple. So they make a religious message out of it. But what's happening in the first part of this story? First of all, Yom Kippur is a happy day. That seems off. Now, there is some rabbinic interpretation that Yom Kippur would become a Yom Kippurim, a day like Purim, in the time of the Messiah. But I think this is more of a sense that at the end of Yom Kippur, you have a sense of relief because the sins are forgiven. We've made it. It's like the relief that Catholics feel on Easter when they say he is risen. The good news, right? The good ending. The happy ending is we've been forgiven. So Yom Kippur was happy, but the 15th of Av, we don't see anywhere else. This is a unique diamond of a relic of this holiday that sounds to us like a holiday of love, or at least a holiday of lust, or matchmaking, eHarmony.com, 2,000 years ago. It's clearly some kind of fertility event. It's on the 15th of the month, after all, and they have to go to ritual immersion before they go out. And they're saying, choose someone not just by the surface, not just by beauty, but by the quality of their character, or maybe the quality of their family. Now, would you see this as a positive love ritual or problematic love ritual? What do you think?
It sounds like a wet white shirt.
A wet white dress contest in the ancient world, maybe. August 3rd. So it's usually in the late July, early August. Yes, it'll always be on a full moon because the Jewish calendar is a moon-based calendar. So they always adjust it so that the 15th is always a full moon and the first of the month is always the new moon. Yeah. Well, again, it's a group dating event, maybe. This is speed dating a long time ago. But again, the criteria are not met for our kind of partnering. Well, here's a third Jewish love story. It's one I imagine you've seen before. As I said, it's from the Jewish nostalgia industry. It's imagining what a traditional marriage is like. And so we'll watch this short video clip and see what can we learn about the traditional marriage from this.
Love. Golda, do you love me?
Do I what?
Do you love me?
Do I love you?
Well,
With our daughters getting married and there's trouble in the town, you're upset, you're worn out, go inside, go lie down. Maybe it's indigestion.
No, Golda, I'm asking you a question. Do you love me?
You're a fool.
I know. But do you love me?
Do I love you?
Well,
For 25 years I've washed your clothes, cooked your meals, cleaned your house, given you children, milked your cow. After 25 years, why talk about love right now?
Golda, the first time I met you was on our wedding day. I was scared.
I was shy.
I was nervous.
So was I.
But my father and my mother said we'd learn to love each other. And now I'm asking, Golda, do you love me?
I'm your wife.
I know. But do you love me?
Do I love him?
Well,
For 25 years I've lived with him, fought with him, starved with him. 25 years my bed is his. If that's not love, what is?
that you love me.
I suppose I do.
And I suppose I love you too. It doesn't change a thing, but even so, after 25 years, it's nice to know
what do we learn about traditional marriage from that song?
Is that to say that marriage not included at all?
Yes, the traditional marriage is an economic arrangement for their prosperity, for the alliance of families. Often a rich family would marry their daughter into a rabbinic scholar line because that was prestigious. The idea of having dowries is a prominent plot line in the whole theme because he's a poor milkman and he has 5 daughters, and how can he marry them off to the right people? He even considers marrying his oldest daughter off to the rich butcher who is way older than she is for the prosperity and the economic arrangement and not because of love. Yeah, sure. Sharon claims it was the same kind of arrangement for her.
If you go into this country, say in the mid-19th century,
Right. In an agricultural world, you needed labor, and children and spouses were cheap labor. They worked for food. Yeah, I mean, it was a symbiotic might be the wrong term. It was a best use case scenario for the two on both sides. Yes, women had many fewer choices than men did. That's for sure. Yeah, I mean, the upper class may have had some choice, but even then, you know, the choices were very constrained and had limited options for them. The idea of marriage for love is very new. You know, the traditional marriage was arranged. It was about property. It was social pressure. I mean, honestly, separation was possible in Jewish life. You could get divorced, even going back 2,000 years. Divorce was a theoretical possibility in the Torah even, but it was really frowned upon. It was discouraged, and there was social pressure to stay. There wasn't an awareness of things that we would call domestic violence or spousal rape. That wasn't even a legal category in the West for a long time, and in some parts of the world even now. Now, when I'm called about marrying a couple in 2023, occasionally the people calling me are a little hesitant because they're calling a rabbi, and one of the people getting married is from a different heritage or religious culture. One of them is Jewish, and one of them comes from this other heritage. And what I do to try to take them out of their nervous state is I'll ask them a simple question. Do you love each other? I don't sing it, but do you love each other? And the answer is yes, of course. And I say, okay, then. That's it, because marrying for love is our standard these days, and people have a right to marry for love. The freedom to marry the person you want to marry is a basic human right. That's why it's ironic sometimes when I talk with our humanistic rabbi colleagues in Israel, that we in America are more free Jewishly than they are, because we can marry whomever we want. And there, because of the Orthodox and religious structure control, you can't marry someone of another religious tradition there. There's no civil marriage. Jews can marry Jews, and Muslims can marry Muslims, but you can't marry across those lines. And they have to go to Cyprus, they have to go to Europe. Now, by the way, you can get married online in Utah, because they've kept the law since COVID. So there are an amazing number of Israelis who are now getting married in Utah virtually over an online Zoom meeting. But that's the quirk, that we are freer here to marry people to the people they love. And for us, love is the standard for marriage. But there's a lot of different ways that people get married these days. Symbols they choose to use, texts they like, approaches to the ceremony that's changed quite a bit. I could have shown you the traditional wedding depicted in Fiddler on the Roof also, because they do actually do a lot of the traditional rituals in that recitation. They're singing sunrise, sunset, but the visual is what's happening in the ceremony. There's a lot of changes of how people get married today. So I wanted to start by asking you, and we'll use the mic to pass it around if anybody wants to share. What are some of the most creative or interesting symbols or texts or readings that you've seen happen at weddings that you've attended in the last 15 or 20 years? Have you seen anything out of the ordinary, something that surprised you, something you found really meaningful?
Well, this was a few years ago. Sharon's cousin was getting.
Can you talk to the mic?
Their daughter was getting married, and the bride and groom had met online, and the wedding was taking place on the North Shore of Long Island on a beautiful summer day, and it was very, and the groom wrote a letter to his wife, which expressed his deep feelings for her and the love, and went on and on. And Sharon and I are sitting in the back and actually on the other side of the aisle from each other. And Sharon says to me, "So Richard, what happened to your letter? Get lost in the mail?" and it was in a voice loud enough that most people heard it. And afterwards, I went up to the groom and admonished him that he really shouldn't be doing such things because it makes us other people look bad.
Well, here's an opportunity for a vow renewal. And then you could write a new letter. Who knows?
Yeah. Okay, I'll work on it.
Anyone else have a story or a symbol or ritual that they've seen? Yeah, Rick?
It's not so much the story or what was said, it's the symbolism of it. It was probably about 15, 20 years ago. I went to my cousin's wedding in Wisconsin, was in their backyard. And there was a canopy of sorts. He is Jewish and she is not. And everybody was turned around and they watched the flower girl come by and they watched the bridesmaids come by and they watched everybody come by. And then they're turning around that way. And then all of a sudden we noticed that in front, the bride was coming this way in a taxi cab and the groom was coming this way in a taxi cab because they were both cab drivers. And so they came to the chuppah in a cab because it meant something to them while everybody was looking behind for the bride and groom to come. And for them, it was very symbolic.
Yeah, nice. One of the major changes that's taken place in weddings these days is the question of whose wedding is it? I mean, obviously you have the couple that are getting married, but if you went back 50 years, who planned the wedding? It was often the mother of the bride who did it the way she wanted it because her mother had planned her wedding and her mother had planned her wedding. And so she assumed this is how it's going to go. But about 30, 40 years ago, brides and grooms decided that they wanted to plan the wedding and make the choices for themselves. And there was a period of maybe 15, 20 years where there was some friction there. And there may still be in some families these days, where the brides have strong opinions about the wedding. Sometimes even the grooms have strong opinions about the wedding, or both brides, if it's two women getting married, have strong opinions about the wedding. And then the parents have to take a backseat because it's not their wedding. In the end, they didn't get a chance to plan a wedding because they endured their parents' planned wedding when they got married, and now their kids are making their own choices themselves. It's less of an issue now. I've been doing weddings now for 24 years, about 400 weddings or so. And I mention this story occasionally, and very few couples resonate with it because by this time, their parents were the ones who had to fight with the parents to plan the wedding. And when it was their turn for their kids, they're willing to take more of a hands-off approach. Not always, but most of the time. They're willing to let the kids take the lead. So it's not as much of a debate anymore whose wedding it really is. Sometimes they want to avoid the wedding entirely. And they have a justice of the peace, or they just plan to go somewhere else, and a planned elopement to a far-off land is valuable. The one thing I do suggest is make sure you're signing a license that's the United States license. You want to go to Mexico, fine, sign a license in my office, then go to Mexico, do whatever you want, but make sure it's legal before you leave the country. So one of the major changes that's taken place is freedom. Nobody these days asks, in the weddings that I do at least, who gives this woman away to be married? Or who presents this woman in marriage is a little bit nicer. Sometimes you'll still get people that want it for a traditional sake, but it's much, much rarer. And if anything, it's who presents this woman in marriage, and both of her parents say, we do. It's not just the father as the patriarch. Now, who walks the bride down the aisle? That depends on what the bride wants, what the family wants, I mean, it's a negotiation. And sometimes it's just a father that walks them down. Sometimes it's both parents who walk them down. And I have some couples where the couple walks themselves down the aisle. They don't need their parents to do that part of the process. I've even had cases where you have older people getting remarried and their kids walk them down the aisle because the kids are old enough to do it. Most couples like to write original vows of some kind, but some are more nervous. They'll say, what are the traditional vows? And I tell them, there are no traditional vows because across traditions, there's no one formula, and Jewish weddings actually don't historically have vows that go two-way. It's only a one-way street from the groom to the bride. But many couples do like to write some kind of original text to each other. Sometimes they've written this at the last minute and they read it off their cell phones at the ceremony. I encourage them to invest in a piece of paper and print it out instead of have their cell phones. But I had a couple that liked the idea of using their cell phones to read the vows, and so they did. And I said, it's your wedding. Remember, it's not your parents' wedding. It's also not my wedding. So it's what they wanted. That's what they were able to do. People get to create their own ketubah texts. A ketubah is a Jewish wedding agreement. Originally, it was about property and a safety net in case of a divorce. It wasn't romantic at all. Now there are lots of different texts out there. There are lots of different designs out there. It's become a work of art that can live on your wall. In fact, my wife and I created our own text when we got married 21 years ago. And we still like to have it on our wall and look at it occasionally. So it's been a positive tradition for us. But when you're writing your own text, it takes on the flavor of what you want to say. In fact, some couples like the text of their ketubah so much, they actually work it into their wedding as part of their vows. And so it becomes a record of their vows on their wall. But there are other challenges with ketubahs. The traditional ketubah was written for a man and a woman. Well, in Hebrew, the grammar changes when you have two women. So one of the first lesbian couples that I worked with on a ceremony, they were actually getting married a date I couldn't do, but I helped them create their ketubah because we had to rework the entire grammar of the whole thing because female plural is a different ending than a male and female plural together. You also have the challenge of Google Translate. So I did a wedding for a family. They were part Indian and part Jewish in the couple. And so they had gotten a ketubah text they liked in English and then plopped it into Google Translate for Hebrew and for Hindi. And of course, the woman who spoke Hindi had gone through and corrected the text because Google Translate, as we know, is only so-so in translating it into new language. They didn't think to check with me about the Hebrew. So I get this text when I show up the day of the wedding, and they say, here, this is the Hebrew ketubah text. And I said, but this is part of this is gobbledygook. And they said, oh yeah, I guess we should have had it checked because, you know, we saw the Hindi was wrong. Well, why would you think the Hebrew was more accurate than the other language? We'll talk more about the difficulties of Google a little bit later. We also get a phenomenon of personal statements. People want their weddings to be personalized. So I tell the story of how they met and their relationship, but sometimes they'll even write a personal statement themselves. Some people aren't comfortable reading a letter in front of everybody or writing a personal vow. That's not their thing to do that in front of 130 people. And so instead, what they might do is write something that I read on their behalf. It's their words and their feelings, but I'm sharing it in an empathetic way. And it can be very moving because it's how they feel about each other. And sometimes they write it as open book to each other, and sometimes it's a surprise. The other person doesn't know what's going to be said about them in the ceremony, and that can be a very meaningful experience. And then there's their choice of readings. There are biblical readings. They can read from their ketubah. I've had readings from A.A. Milne's Winnie the Pooh, the Velveteen Rabbit. I mean, there's a lot of beautiful stuff out there from all kinds of genres that it can be very moving. And I tell couples, when you're looking for a wedding reading, just Google wedding readings and you'll get some really cheesy things and some really nice things. And it's your taste, and other people can read, doesn't have to be me. This is the downside to freedom. There's a lot of choices. But I would rather live in a world with lots of choices and with freedom to choose. Now, another area that's majorly changed in weddings. Remember how Jacob was told, don't marry one of those Canaanite women? Well, that ship has sailed a long time ago in the Jewish community, that most marriages of Jews to anybody have been to non-Jewish partners. Now going back to the 1990s, we're talking over 30 years. Over half of weddings involving Jews are to a non-Jewish partner. So now we have a whole generation of children of those partnerships that are themselves looking to get married. And many of them have been raised in Jewish households. They've celebrated Jewish holidays. Now there's even increasing communities that will welcome them as members, allow them to celebrate their own bar and bat mitzvahs. So there are many, many more children of intermarriage who are themselves getting married. And sometimes they're marrying someone who's Jewish, sometimes they're marrying someone else who's a child of intermarriage, sometimes they're marrying someone who's not Jewish, but they ask me to be a part of their ceremony. But it's the norm now for their parents and for their peers. Large numbers of their peers are partnered with people of other religious heritages and cultures and ethnicities. That's the norm now in the college-educated set, and it will be the norm going forward. And I'm a lot less busy than humanistic rabbis were 30 years ago. When Sherwin Wine and Daniel Friedman were some of the only rabbis in the Midwest who would officiate at intermarriages, let alone co-officiate with other clergy at intermarriages, or do it on a Saturday, or do it in a box, or do it with a fox. I mean, there were a lot of conditions people would put on these things. They would marry people for love, and they were very busy. Dan Friedman would talk about how he did, I think, 20 weddings in one weekend because he was the only one available that Memorial Day weekend. And so he could tell them, you have to get married at 10 a.m. because I've got a noon, a 2, a 4, and a 6, and that's it. But they wanted a rabbi, they had to do it. I am not that busy because there are more rabbis willing to do it. There are more congregations willing to accept those families. And by the way, part of freedom is the freedom to say, you know, I don't think I want a rabbi at all. And we're just going to do it ourselves. Another new phenomenon, as people have become more secularized in America, the growth of what's called the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, people who don't identify with any particular religious tradition, or people who may connect with a cultural heritage, but not Jewishness religiously, is what I would call interfaithless couples. Now, interfaithless couples means neither one is particularly religious, but they're from different cultural heritages. They have different religious traditions in their family. It's not that they're faithless, they're interfaithless. And the reality of those situations is sometimes the Jewish partner actually is a Reformed Jew or even a conservative Jew, but it turns out in terms of religious attendance and God belief, liberal Jews map out a lot like non-religious general population in terms of how often they go to synagogue, how much they care about being religious, how personally religious they are. So you'll often find a totally secular, not Jewish person marrying a nominally religious Jewish person because their lifestyles are actually very similar. And so it really is more of an interfaithless marriage. It's not like they're arguing over where to go on Sunday morning. It's whether they go anywhere on Sunday morning. It's more of the debate. One of the things I like the most in the last 15 years or so has been creative approaches to incorporating tradition. Have you ever seen a bride and a groom circle each other at a wedding? So traditionally, the groom would circle the bride 7 times. If you watch the Fiddler on the Roof wedding, she does a 7 circuit. Why 7? 7 days of the week, right? It's a magic number in Jewish life. But also it's to get rid of the evil spirits because it's a magic number. That's why she wears a veil. That's why they break the glass. There's a lot of superstition involved in the wedding. But now what you see is a mutual circling. So the bride might circle the groom 3 times, and the groom circles the bride 3 times, and they do 1 circuit together. It still adds up to 7, but it's a more balanced tradition. You can certainly incorporate elements of the partner's culture and religious tradition into the ceremony, or sometimes couples will do a double header. They'll do the Indian wedding on Saturday and the Jewish wedding on Sunday, and the Indian wedding being 3.5 hours long. The Jewish wedding looks much better by contrast because it's only about 30 minutes. I have done a couple of co-officiated Jewish and Hindu weddings, or Hindu weddings, as they're sometimes called. But I managed to negotiate it down to about 1.5 hours because we have to be realistic in that context because we want to include Jewish things. And there are certain parallels. They also have the number 7 as an important part of the ritual. And so we find commonalities there too. Another interesting development is multilingual weddings, because of course, love doesn't confine itself to English. And so sometimes you'll have couples from different heritages where the family of one of the couples doesn't really speak that much English. And so then you have to decide how much to incorporate the other language into the ceremony. It could be a reading, you could do the vows in 2 languages or exchange rings in Hebrew and English and Spanish and English, depending on which partner connects to which language. I've even had ceremonies where they have an English language officiant and a Spanish language officiant. And so parts of the ceremony are primarily in Spanish with an abbreviated English translation. And then my part of the ceremony is primarily in English with a short Spanish translation. So I definitely stretch my Spanish in that context. You can even be creative in approaching an old text like the 7 blessings. So the traditional 7 blessings talk mostly about God. And I have an adapted humanist text that some couples like to use. But sometimes they'll simply choose 7 friends or 7 pairs of friends and say, give us something nice, something you hope for the future, a blessing you offer to us. I had one couple, it was actually my first man-man gay wedding. And because the traditional 7 blessings text is heteronormative, it's focused on a man and a woman getting married, that didn't work for them. So they took me up on the idea of choosing 7 friends and having them choose a text or write something for them. And one of their friends had the perfect blessing. He got up there to speak and he said, a blessing on your house, mazel tov, mazel tov. Imagine such a spouse, mazel tov, mazel tov, and such a son-in-law like no one ever saw, David and Jeremy. Because each side was getting a son-in-law. And I thought, what a great adaptive use of Fiddler on the Roof again, but for a same-sex partnership wedding. I mean, it was great. It was perfect. The perfect blessing for that setting. So being a creative approach to those things can actually make it more meaningful and relevant. And of course, there's the tradition of each partner breaking a glass at the wedding instead of only having the groom do it. One of the Jewish brides I married said, I'm good at breaking things. So she wanted to make sure to break something. And what my wife and I chose to do, we each broke a glass at ours as well, although she missed hers the first couple times because it's hard to see her feet under the wedding dress at times. But what we did was we broke 2 different colored glasses, and then they made the shards into 2 different objects, 2 different a blue and green glass mezuzah and a blue and green glass Kiddush cup. So that was a way of saving that moment of the ceremony and bringing it into our lives together. Of course, we deal with the new life circumstances of the 21st century. As I mentioned, same-sex partnerships, the grammar on the ketubah, honestly, even telling who gets which ring. It was easier for me when I had a man and a woman because the fingers usually are very different sizes. But if it's 2 men or 2 women, the rings look very similar. So I came up to a fast solution when this happened. I just held them out and they picked the right one because they knew who was went to whom. So that worked out just fine. You also have, of course, the circumstance of remarriage with older children, involving them in the ceremony, doing readings, holding the rings, holding the wine cup, or as I mentioned, walking their parents down the aisle, or standing at the chuppah with them, just as parents stand with children, sometimes children can stand with parents. Now, one of the more challenging things, for me at least, is that secularization raises that question, who needs a rabbi? Whether the rabbi is a stranger who we've never met or someone who's known me for a long time, but who needs a rabbi when I have a friend who can use Google? I can Google Jewish wedding. I can YouTube examples of what rabbis say at weddings. I can put together a script. I'm an actor. I can deliver a script. I know this couple. I can talk about their story. Well, why do I need a rabbi? I can get ordained on the internet for $25 at the Universal Life Church or the Church of Judaism, or there's all kinds of options out there these days. Who needs a rabbi? Now, I have to make the argument that, well, I think of weddings as surgery. I wouldn't let someone who just studied a video on the internet do surgery on it. Now, if your wedding is like plumbing or electrical work, you can have a hobbyist that does, and it can do a good job, or you might get zapped, but it's up to you. And if you think a wedding is like mowing the lawn, then sure, let the neighborhood kid do it. Who cares? Right? It'll grow back. But if you think that weddings are serious business and you want it to be exactly the way you want it, then maybe you want to talk to someone with knowledge and experience and expertise and skill, and someone who maybe does know you. Well, I can try. I had one couple who said, we want you to come sign the ketubah and leave, because they wanted their friend to do the wedding and they didn't want me telling them what to do. See, they assumed I would rabbi like other rabbis rabbi and tell them what to do. So instead, I said, well, let's talk through your options for the ceremony. And in the end, I co-officiated the wedding with their close friend. He talked about their partnership because he knew it better. And I supervised the wine sharing and the ring giving and things like that. And it actually worked out to be a very nice balance. But I had to talk myself into it because their initial response was, we don't want you to tell us what to do. And my job is not to tell you what to do. I'm the travel agent. You tell me where you want to go. I'll help you get there. You can't rely on statistics with these things because people will ask me, how successful are your weddings? And my answer is they all got married. After that, it's up to them. So I can't even guarantee longevity. You know, if you have me do the wedding, then it'll, you know, I can't do that. What have been my favorite weddings? The favorite things, it's impossible to choose. In just the last 12 months, I led a wedding for a woman whose bat mitzvah I had officiated. And I led a remarriage for a woman whose son's bar mitzvahs I had celebrated and led. I officiated at a lesbian wedding at the University of Chicago. And I also officiated at my first wedding for a trans couple this year. I did a wedding for in front of 20 people at Rosewood Beach in Highland Park. I did a wedding for 200 people in a fancy hotel ballroom in Rosemont. I've done weddings for Kol Hadash members and weddings for total strangers who don't even live in town and I may never see again. Every wedding was different and beautiful and wonderful in its own way. And I always tell couples that weddings are one of my favorite parts of the job. People want to be happy, and I get to help them be happy. When they break the glass, or if they break the glasses, and everyone cries Mazel Tov, and they give them applause for that first married kiss, it's one more example that love in the 21st century still wins.